mentioned, my name is Lowry, and my project focuses on using a biomedical knowledge graph to make medical diagnosis predictions. So I'll start with a bit of background about myself. I received my undergraduate and master's degrees in physics from Oxford University, where I focused on astrophysics and cosmology. And then I took a big change for my PhD and focused instead on biophysics. And there I got into neuroscience, specifically working on cellular neuroscience and understanding how retinal circuits wire together during development in the mouse retina. And then for my postdoctoral research, I was still in neuroscience, but I moved more towards computational neuroscience. I was working with a team to understand how depression and anxiety, biomarkers for depression and anxiety in electrical recordings of the human brain. And so we worked with these large scale recordings where we were recording from many sites in the brain and then analyzing these time series to extract biomarkers of depression and anxiety. And so this was sort of my happy space between kind of my quantitative physics background and my interest in neuroscience. And it led me quite naturally into this fellowship, which focuses on health and biomedical data science with a specific focus on sort of addressing clinical needs and sort of patient-facing and clinician-facing. So to start with an overview of the problem that I'm trying to tackle. So since we've had electronic health records, there's been a big push to use them to make medical diagnosis predictions. And it's thought that this will lead to a lot of benefits in healthcare, including increased accuracy of diagnoses, driving personalized medicine or precision medicine approaches. And then with the development of accurate predictions, then it could lead to sort of increased preventative medicine and improved general public health. So there are a lot of potential advantages. So EHRs are great in that they capture routine and longitudinal patient data, but they're very coarse-grained and they lack a lot of the rich phenotyping that's needed for sort of accurate diagnostic predictions. And if you've ever looked at your own medical record, you know that it also can contain a lot of incomplete information and sometimes some inaccuracies as well. And so this makes them somewhat challenging to use in the purpose of diagnostic predictions. So the goal of my project is to see if we can integrate EHR data with prior domain knowledge in the form of a biomedical knowledge graph in order to improve the accuracy of diagnosis predictions. And I'm specifically focusing on one medical focus, so that's neurodegenerative disease and dementia. So these are diseases that affect a lot of people worldwide, and those rates are expected to increase as the population ages. At the moment, there's currently no cure, so sort of everything is in the diagnosis, and a diagnosis currently requires a highly trained specialist to look at brain imaging and perform cognitive tests, and it's been sort of described as an art. It's quite a complex procedure. So having the accurate diagnosis is very important for knowing sort of how the disease is likely to progress and what possible symptomatic treatments can be used as well. So there are a lot of different disorders that fall under the sort of umbrella of neurocognitive or dementia disorders. I've sort of classified them here in terms of dementias that mostly affect cognitive skills and memory, but then there's also ataxias, which can cause changes in voluntary movement and movement disorders. So there are a lot of overlapping symptoms in these disorders, and they include things like memory loss, personality and mood changes, and increased apathy, and then the ones that also include motor deficits. People can have difficulty in doing things like walking, speaking, navigating. And I'm sure that you've heard a lot about a lot of the diseases on these lists, like Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, ALS, but there are really a lot of different diseases that fall under this category. So I've broadly classified my project into two main specific aims. There's aim one is diagnostic subtyping, so that means being able to stratify patients who are experiencing these types of symptoms into their diagnostic subtypes. And then aim two focuses more on on diagnosis prediction. So being able to predict the future risk that someone will develop dementia based on their current and past medical history. And the goal is to really leverage the patient electronic health record data that is in the UCSF healthcare system. So making use of a lot of the data that's already collected during routine care, and then by sort of aggregating across all the patients that we have at our disposal, being able to make some more kind of precision medicine types of diagnoses. So one of the benefits of this Innovate for Health Fellowship program is that it involves a partnership between 3 leading institutes, so UC Berkeley, UCSF, and Janssen, J&J. And so we sort of have the pleasure of working with a really good group of people from each of the 3 institutions. And so for my project, I've sort of got an advisory committee composed of these 5 members who've all been incredibly helpful in sort of guiding the project and contributing technical and domain-specific expertise. So what's been done in this space? Quite a lot has been done and continues to be done. There's been a lot of focus on kind of predicting Alzheimer's disease and possible dementia using things like imaging biomarkers of the brain, blood tests, electronic health records. There's also quite a big push in industry to tackle this question of, can we predict dementia diagnosis, where people are using various different data types, including speech data and eye tracking. And I'd say that a lot of these, they have some success, some work better than others, but it's certainly not a solved problem. It's quite an active area of research, and there's constantly more that's being done. So the approach that we're taking is to use a knowledge graph. So here, just to describe in a bit more detail what a knowledge graph is, you can think of it as a machine-readable encyclopedia, or a way of representing human knowledge in a machine-readable format. So all it is so simply a large graph where made of nodes and edges. So the nodes in the graph correspond to objects that we might know as an object in the world, and then the edges between them represent how those objects are related to one another. And so this is just an example of, so Google is sort of powered by a big knowledge graph, and so this is just an example of part of it that kind of describes how, say, cars are related to where they're manufactured and so on. And so one of the features of a knowledge graph is that every node can represent a different type of information. Like, for instance, here, a car and a place. So in the sort of data science world, there are a lot of different ways of studying knowledge graphs or using them to extract important information. And one method that's received a lot of attention and being developed by the community is to use a knowledge graph embedding model. And so what this involves is representing a node or an edge by a low dimensional vector. And so you have some mapping, some transformation that will transform your graph or map your graph into a set of vectors. And then once we've got this set of vectors, then it's a lot easier to perform sort of computational and mathematical, linear algebra on that set of vectors, and you can use that to extract knowledge. So you can kind of think of this for the people who are familiar with word embeddings in natural language processing. It's sort of the equivalent of that you're representing knowledge in the graph by a vector. So the knowledge graph that I use is called SPOKE, which stands for Scalable Precision Medicine Knowledge Engine. And this is being developed, pioneered by the Baronzini Lab and a large team, the SPOKE Tech team at UCSF, who are part of the Baker Computational Health Sciences Institute. And they've done an amazing job at pulling together a lot of biological data, different types of biological data from a number of open databases that I've sort of listed here. And the graph relates all of these different pieces of biological information together. So just as an example, if we're starting from the disease node, Those can be connected to genes. So you sort of know which genes are upregulated, downregulated, or associated with a disease. You might have also symptoms that are connected to the diseases, medications or compounds that are known to treat some of the diseases. Those are linked to side effects and so on and so forth. And the team is constantly, it's a sort of it's an evolving graph. The team's constantly adding in new databases and new types of information. I think they've recently pulled in the microbiome information and exposure information from environmental exposures. So it's really a very rich resource. So one of the sort of challenges one of the first steps, if we want to use Spoke to make predictions about medical data. So you'll notice that Spoke as it stands doesn't contain any patient data or any medical information. So we have to find a way of sort of mapping the biological data onto the patient data. And this was work done largely by Charlotte Nelson in the Baronzini lab, which was to figure out how the information that's in Spoke maps onto some of the medical variables that we commonly find in the electronic health record. So just as an example, in the EHR, we'll have diagnosis codes in the form of ICD or SNOMED diagnosis codes, and those could map onto disease nodes or symptom nodes or side effect nodes in Spoke. If we've got RX norm prescriptions, so the RX norm is the coding of medical prescriptions, then those can map onto compound nodes. And then abnormal lab values can map onto anatomy, where the lab result was taken from, also what compounds are involved, and then what pharmacological class the lab corresponds to. And so what she found is that about 2% of Spoke, of all of Spoke, can map on almost directly onto one of these types of medical variables. So there's still sort of, you have 98% of Spoke that is this sort of extra information that you won't readily find in a medical record. So to give you a bird's eye overview of the approach that I'm taking here. So on the one side, we're starting with Spoke, the knowledge graph, and then what we want to ultimately do is use it to make diagnostic predictions. So I've broken the problem down into three main steps. So the first step is, as I briefly described, to transform Spoke into, use a knowledge graph embedding model to embed Spoke into a low dimensional vector space. The second step is then to integrate or merge the knowledge graph with information that's in the patient medical records. And then the last step is to use those patient embeddings to train a learning algorithm to make diagnostic predictions. So to go into a bit more detail about each of those steps. So knowledge graph embedding algorithms, as I mentioned, the goal is to have a mapping that will transform your knowledge graph into a set of vectors that preserves the inherent relationship information that's held within the graph. So you can think of a knowledge graph as, and its node and edge representations as being a set of what's called triples. So head, relation, tail, triples, where the head and the tail correspond to two nodes, and then the relation is the edge that's joining them. And you can represent the whole graph just by a whole list of these triples or a set of triples. So there are many different approaches that people have taken to try and model knowledge graphs using these triples. So here I've just shown, for example, two different classes of models that they can fall under. The simplest model that you can do is a distance model. So here, if you're thinking of your nodes, relations, and edges as tails as sort of directional vectors, then you can literally think of it as a head plus a relation equals a tail. And then your learning algorithm is trying to optimize, trying to minimize the space between these vectors. But this is a very simple model, and it can only really handle the simplest types of knowledge graph. So semantic models are a bit more flexible and a bit more sophisticated. And there you're trying to capture more semantic similarity between the nodes and edges. So what that means mathematically is effectively finding a dot product between your nodes and edges. Since two vectors that have a high dot product are sort of semantically similar to each other. So there are a lot of different types of models that fall under this category, such as the dist-mult model, which involves a trilinear dot product between the 3 different vectors, and then the complex model is basically the same thing, but now you're limited. You're in a complex vector space, so you're not limited to sort of just the real vectors. So I've honed in on this complex model as being the appropriate one to use for modeling spoke. That's because it can handle asymmetric relationships, so it can handle a directed graph. It can handle end-to-end mapping, so n nodes mapping onto n other nodes, and because the dot product is pretty computationally simple, it's an efficient model. So before sort of fitting a knowledge graph embedding model, I went through a step of what I'm calling graph pruning. So just selecting the nodes that are most relevant to my particular task. So as I mentioned, spoke is very big. It's up to 400,000 nodes, and it's constantly growing, and it's getting bigger and bigger. So we don't necessarily need all of that information in our model. So my approach was to start with just the subset of nodes that were kind of already found, like directly map onto the a medical variable in the EHR. So as I mentioned, that's about 2% of spoke, and then just walked up and down spoke from those nodes to determine how many to keep. And at a certain point, we'll have traversed the whole graph. And so we're sort of looking for the sweet spot where we've not sort of traversed the whole graph yet. So here what I'm showing is starting from this 2% of EHR mapped nodes, sort of stepping either 1, 2, 3 steps away from them, how many edges and how many nodes of all of spoke do we end up covering? And so what you see is that after 2 steps, you've stepped across sort of 20% of all nodes, but you've actually covered almost 90% of edges. And so what that tells us is that sort of a small number of nodes actually contains the majority of the relational information. And so, so I decided to set the threshold at 2 steps since it just seemed like a sort of reasonable starting point. So this is what spoke looks like after fitting a knowledge graph embedding model to it, specifically the complex embedding model. For those interested, I'm using the AmpliGraph Python library that's being developed by Accenture. If anybody else is working on embedding models, I would definitely recommend referring to this library because it's a pretty good one. So here, every dot in this graph corresponds to a different node in spoke. I've mapped it onto a 300-dimensional vector space, and the different colors correspond to the different types of node. So this big pink cloud corresponds to all the disease nodes. This red cloud corresponds to all the gene nodes, and so on. And so the way that you can kind of think about this, it's really hard to visualize a high-dimensional complex entity in 2 dimensions. But the way you can kind of think about this is that if you start from, say, a disease node, say you've got a disease node that represents Alzheimer's disease, then that will have a mapping onto the ApoE4 gene in this gene cloud, which would tell us that this gene ApoE4 associates with Alzheimer's disease. And so that's kind of the transformation from going from one cloud to another. And the idea is that sort of once you've got spoke or your knowledge graph sort of represented in this form, then you might be able to uncover new relationships and find new information by applying some linear algebra techniques to it. So then the question is, how are we going to use these embeddings for our particular task, which is to make dementia diagnosis predictions? So as a reminder, the 2 focuses that the 2 aims that I'm focusing on are diagnostic subtyping and then early dementia diagnosis. So after trying a number of different approaches, I actually found that this unsupervised approach was a good place to build off of. And so the idea is just trying to understand how patients that have any dementia diagnosis code in their medical record, so so anybody that has been diagnosed with some form of dementia, how do they map onto the knowledge graph embedding space? And do we see any patient clustering or separation depending on which diagnosis code they have? So since there are a lot of different types of dementia, there are also a lot of different diagnosis codes that code for dementia. So here are some of the main ones, and they fall into a number of different categories, like sort of age-related decline, mild cognitive impairment. There are a few codes that are sort of unspecified as sort of a general or unspecified dementia, and then the more specified Alzheimer's disease and related disease codes like vascular dementia, Alzheimer's disease, frontotemporal lobe dementia. So I extracted all the patients in the UCSF database that have at least one of these codes in their record, and that led to about 14,000 different patients. And I pulled out the following information on each of those patients. So which conditions they had, sort of all of their past medical history in terms of their ICD-10 diagnosis codes, also any medications that they've been prescribed, and then any abnormal lab results. And just to make a note, I haven't included demographic information for a few reasons, but obviously age is a very important factor or predictor in dementia diagnosis. And so at a later stage, I'll sort of think a bit about how to bring that in, but for the moment, it's not included. So as I said, the sort of first step is mapping a patient's medical record onto Spoke. And so here you can kind of think of the diagnosis codes that they have in their record are going to map directly onto Spoke nodes that encode diseases, symptoms, or side effects. The medications will map onto compounds, and the lab results will map onto compounds, anatomy, and pharmacological class. And so you can kind of think of it as populating this big sort of patient table where one patient's medical record can be thought of as sort of Spoke hits and misses. So which nodes are sort of present in a patient medical record and which ones are absent. And just to give a little bit of a more kind of visual of what I mean by that. So if I look at just these ICD-10 dementia codes, they map onto a set of corresponding Spoke nodes. So things like Alzheimer's disease, and there are a lot of different subtypes of Alzheimer's disease in this database, the disease ontology database. It's because they each correspond to a different gene that's been associated with them. So that's sort of not information that you will get from the medical record, but it's sort of encoded within Spoke. And then, yeah, you can sort of see that you're seeing a lot of the same, a lot of these diseases are encoded by a single node in Spoke, like say Lewy body dementia or ALS. And again, just sort of for visualization purposes to give you a feel for where these where these nodes map onto in Spoke in this embedding that we've got. These are the so these Spoke mapped ICD-10 codes are shown in this diagram. We had a few disease nodes, and then a few of them also sort of fell under the side effect or symptom nodes. And if I then just look at the first order connections to each of these nodes, then that's what I've plotted here. These are the first order connected nodes. And there's not sort of too much to pull away from this, other than there does seem to be sort of a cluster up here of other nodes that are somehow associated with dementia diagnosis nodes, and then a lot of genes that are also kind of found at the, say, tip of the cloud. So as I said, there's not too much to kind of take away from this. It's just really for schematics and kind of visualization purposes. So going back to the question of figuring out patient embeddings. So the approach that I've taken is I've taken these 14,000 patients who have a dementia ICD-10 code in their database, and then I've mapped them on, or I've sort of populated the spoke matrix to say, which spoke nodes are kind of present in their record versus which are not. So sort of collected all of those spoke map nodes for the variables in their medical record. And then as a first step, I'm sort of taking the simplest approach, which is, so each of those nodes, spoke nodes that they have in their record correspond to, they have an associated vector with them, which comes from fitting that complex embedding model. And so then I've just averaged all of those mean spoke embeddings for all the nodes that are present in their medical record, but excluding the ones that are directly diagnostic. So if the patient was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, I'm not including the Alzheimer's disease node in their embedding, because ultimately what I'm trying to predict is the disease diagnosis. So that effectively will then map patients onto this knowledge graph embedding space by sort of finding their mean medical record vector. And then just I performed a principal components analysis across the patient embeddings to see whether there's any type of structure that emerges. So do patients cluster or separate once I've mapped them into this knowledge graph embedding space? And so this is sort of the simplest, first step approach that I can take. I'm not sure if sort of calculating the mean is the right thing to do, but there are several things that I'm working on kind of iterating and improving. So a big one is selecting only the relevant medical history. So maybe only the most recent history or just the most predictive comorbidities, but not sort of averaging over a whole patient's medical history. I think it will also be important to exclude things like medications, and some medications are, with Parkinson's disease, is often taking levodopa. So I'd want to exclude those that are obviously diagnostic. And then kind of building on from that, might be important to weight the input variables with different importance. I think that one of the big sort of benefits of using a knowledge graph like Spoke is to also use the first order connections, since that's kind of extra rich information that we don't have directly from the medical record. And so I want to figure out a way to bring in those connections as well. And then just the last bullet point is, a PCA, I've really just done that mainly for visualization to start with, but there might be other dimension reduction approaches that are more suited to the task at hand and that aren't necessarily linear reductions. So this is what the patient embeddings look like, plotted as the first two principal components. So here, every dot corresponds to a patient. And the first thing that you notice is that it's sort of one big blob. There is a little bit of structure, but there certainly aren't discrete clusters that we might have expected, if the diseases were very different to one another. So then what I did was color-coded each patient by which disease or ICD-10 diagnosis code was prominent in that patient and its 50 nearest neighbors. So it had to be which diagnosis was overrepresented by that patient and its neighbors compared to the rest of the whole population. And when you do that, then you start to see some more interesting structure come out. So without going into too many of the details, but you can sort of see a yellow cluster up here, and that corresponds to ALS from the legend. And then down here, it's more sort of pink and blue, which is frontotemporal lobe dementia and MCI, mild cognitive impairment. And so, what this is telling us is that there is some separation of the patients by their dominant disease type, but then there's also, they're not discrete clusters, as I said. There is also a very large overlap in these different diseases, and at this point, I don't know if that's a feature or a bug. Like, I don't know if it's actually, a patient. It can be somewhere along the spectrum, and they actually, they might have one of two diseases, or they're more likely to have one disease versus another. But that's sort of my initial interpretation of what this could represent. So then what I've done is use this this plot to make what I'm calling disease heat maps. So by applying a kernel density estimation over each of the different subtypes of diseases, then we can sort of construct these heat maps that tell us how overrepresented a particular disease is, depending on where you are in this space. And so what you'll kind of notice here is that on the top here are diseases that are more likely to be associated with cognitive impairments. And you can see that there is certainly sort of an overlap, like there's a big overlap with the mild cognitive impairment and say frontotemporal lobe dementia and Alzheimer's disease. And that's kind of to be expected. I think a lot of people who have these diseases will have had mild cognitive impairment at some point in their medical history. And then on the bottom here is particularly ALS and progressive supranuclear palsy. Those are diseases that are more commonly associated with motor deficits. And you'll sort of notice that they fall, the sort of heat cloud for that falls in a slightly different part of the map. So what I'm doing next is to then use these kernel density estimations to make diagnostic predictions. And what I'm thinking about along this line is for the patient stratification. So I would want to be able to construct a Bayesian classifier that can build off of the kernel density estimations and be able to predict the diagnosis of unseen patients, based on sort of how likely they are to have one disease versus another. And then in the context of patient trajectories, so I'm interested in seeing how patients move through this space over time. So for example, if patients are starting, say, with mild cognitive impairment, do we sort of see them moving more towards one cluster that might indicate one type of dementia versus another, if we sort of plot their embeddings over time. And I think it'll also be really interesting to see whether the patient clusters can tell us anything about the underlying biological profiles of the dementias, sort of what's going on in the brain, what type of sort of proteinopathy is underlying it and causing the disease. And then, of course, once models have been developed, sort of validating it on a totally unseen and new EHR data set. So before getting to that point, there are a number of things that I'm currently working on. So a big thing that you'll notice is that's missing from this is controls. So I'm working on figuring out where and how age and sex matched controls map onto this space. And so there, the question would also be more sort of, can we predict, just who is going to develop dementia versus who is not. And then I think it's also really important to refine the patient cohort. So the EHR is definitely messy, and a lot of these diagnosis codes, we don't know how much we can truly trust the accuracy of the diagnosis. And so the way that I'm getting around this is to focus just on patients who have had a specialty visit at the Memory and Aging Center at UCSF, because those will be diagnoses that we can really trust. And then I've sort of mentioned, I've touched on a few of these other points as well, but selecting only the most relevant patient history and not including everything. I think, as I said, I started with kind of calculating a mean embedding. That was really just the easiest first step to try. And if anybody listening has any other ideas on, what could be an effective sort of mapping approach, then I'd be really interested in hearing that. And then also kind of bringing back the question of demographics, then I think it'll be important to understand how predictions vary if we stratify the patients that we have by, say, race, ethnicity, or age, to make sure that we're not kind of encoding in any types of biases into the modeling. So to end, I'd like to say thank you to everybody, in particular to the Innovate Health Program, all the other program fellows, my advisory committee, everyone on the Spoke Tech team, and thank you for building such a great resource. And to the co-directors and the steering committee. So thank you, everybody, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kirkby. Round of applause, I'm sure, from all the attendees. We welcome your questions in the Q&A, and we have one lined up. The question is from Haley Hunter Zink. I'll allow Haley to talk in case there's a follow-up question, but her question is, could the same approach be used to do patient segmentation within a disease? For example, to segment patients with COVID-19 with respect to disease progression outcomes?
I don't see why not. I think, yeah, it's something that I've been trying to, while developing this specifically for sort of dementias and neurocognitive disorders, I've also been trying to think about sort of, yeah, just what is a kind of general approach that you can leverage a knowledge graph to make diagnostic predictions. And so, yeah, my intuition would be, if it works for one disease, it probably would work for another. And I think that, yeah, applying it to something like COVID could be super interesting and important.
Great, thank you for that question and for that answer. The next question comes from Gundolf Schenk, and I'll allow him to talk if he wants any follow-up question. But what about a time series for the patient features? What would you need to make this temporal approach possible?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'm definitely still kind of thinking about that, trying to wrap my head around a bit. I guess what I was sort of thinking was first just sort of looking at how, as I said, how patients kind of move through this space. And then maybe we would want to use the, where they fall in PCA space as the kind of input to, say, a time series analysis, like a temporal type of model, like, I don't know, either an LSTM or some other type of model that takes into account kind of recent history and can predict sort of the next time step. So that was kind of what I had in mind. But as I say, I'm still kind of chewing on that a bit.
Sounds good. When you think about these temporal events, they happen in different timescales for different patients, right? So
they do, exactly. Yeah. So that's why I was kind of wondering if sort of normalizing it to, say, a trajectory in PCA space might, like kind of trying to map it onto some shared set of axes might be able to kind of account for that. So I'm not necessarily trying to just predict the next, I don't know, time point in the medical record, but I'm trying to predict something about sort of the direction that something's moving in an abstract space. Yeah. At this point, I really don't know if that's sort of the right approach or if it will work, but that's roughly what I sort of had in mind.
Yeah, that sounds good. I'd love to follow up with you on that and have another project where we have a similar question.
Okay, yeah, sure, sounds great.
Great, we have 2 questions lined up already, but I'll first ask Atul Butte's question. What's the minimum amount of EHR info needed for this to work? And how do you make sure you aren't just picking up on the doctor's suspicions from the EHR data?
Yeah, that's super interesting questions and a big challenge. So it's kind of to answer the second one first. I think that by filtering based on the specialty visits is probably a good starting point. And after a lot of discussion with Kate Rankin, who's a clinician at the Memory and Aging Center, it really seems like you can trust the diagnoses from the Memory and Aging Center. Like, they are very accurate, and so using that as some type of ground truth seems like a good place to start. How that then translates back to what we see in the primary care situation, I don't really know yet. Yeah, if you have any thoughts on that, I'd be really curious to know. What was the first question? Can you remind me, Andrew, please?
What's the minimum amount of EHR info needed for this to work?
I don't have a solid answer for that yet. Just based on, so I can't answer that in the context of the timing because I haven't done a good enough time series analysis yet. So I don't know how much kind of medical history we need to make to really see anything. But in terms of the patient heat maps, so I've currently got about, as I said, 14,000 patients in there. But even taking just the ones from the Memory and Aging Center, the sort of specialty ones, that was about 3,000 patients. And even there, we were getting a pretty good coverage across the whole space and across all the different diseases. So, I want to say sort of in the order of a few thousand patients, but I don't know, I can't really give you an estimate yet of how much medical history we need. I'd say that on average, most of my patients have about 2 to 5 years of data. And there's a tail that have more, but yeah, that's sort of roughly what I've got.
Great, thank you, Dr. Kirkby. The next question is from another Johnson & Johnson Innovate for Health Fellow. This question comes from Ben. Your use of controls is interesting since do you think you'd ultimately see a spectrum of patients where some might show intermediate symptoms as being able to find people who might be on the way to dementia, perhaps similar to Gundolf's time course question?
Yeah, yeah, and actually, so I've started doing the control analysis already, and I am starting to see like the two populations do separate, but there certainly is an overlap. And so I'm quite curious to see whether like who that overlap corresponds to. Like, is it patients who are starting to show some symptoms of dementia or some type of memory loss or cognitive decline? Yeah, and it will be interesting also to track those patients and see whether they do, develop dementias at future time points.
Any follow-up, Ben? I'm letting you talk if you'd like.
No, that's great. Thank you, Lowry. I think, yeah, it was kind of similar to what Gundolf was asking as well. Yeah, so thanks.
Great, thanks. And I think the next question also comes from the great conversation that Gundolf started, but this question comes from Jenny Lee. Or use age as a shared time scale?
Oh yeah, that's an interesting point. Yeah, so not every disease kind of peaks at the same age. Like there is kind of a different age distribution depending on exactly what the disease is. So it would be interesting, yeah, to sort of leverage that for making more accurate disease subtyping. But within a disease, yeah, that could be an interesting axis to use.
Very fruitful conversation.
Yeah, the other challenge there, I'll just say, is that the data is de-identified, and age is one of the things that gets kind of shuffled around a bit. And patients who are over 90, they all get automatically set to just being 90 years old. And so there is sort of this artifact of kind of a lot of patients that suddenly are in the 90 age bin. So I think that type of thing could work for the younger bit, where before the de-identification process sort of impacts the results.
Very true. Any other questions in the chat or the Q&A?
I'll stop my share screen. That's all right.
Not seeing any questions popping up. Any last burning questions for our speaker? Well, I feel like you answered everyone's questions. If there's no more burning questions, I think I will conclude this research exchange forum by thanking once again our speaker, Dr. Kirkby, and thank you all for attending. And I hope you have a good Monday. Thank you all.
Yeah, thanks everyone.